Very interesting morning sessions. We have heard a side of the decarbonization story till this point of time, parts of which, and I must say that when we from the industry, and I'm going to use this occasion to sort of place myself on the side of industry when I'm talking about decarbonization, but I am more on the side of trying to figure out how, not only as a nation but as a people, we are looking at sustainable practices, trying to figure out how our own footprint of carbon emissions can be brought down, and all the things that we were hearing from the morning today in terms of sustainable living, sustainable evolution is something that we can practice in our daily lives. I can assure you that a lot of the work that is happening from the policy levels as well as from the industry is also driven by the same set of humans who are in these industries, right? But having said that, companies or large industries do not only act on human impulses, right? They also need economic benefits for people to really move towards. So in that context, we will be touching upon an aspect of government policies and the set of incentives that will provide a long-term view on decarbonization. While we have been talking about India's sort of reducing carbon emission intensity and a lot of integration of renewables and so on, the fact remains that we are growing. We are one of the largest, high growth, large economies in the world. Our CO2 profile in absolute terms has been growing. The carbon intensity of power generation, of energy production, I'll correct myself, is one of the highest in the world when you look at similar sized countries. So while we might have done a lot of work in terms of integrating renewables, etc., even if you look at the per capita consumption, it is quite low compared to other developed countries. But when you look at the absolute emissions, there is a long way to go. Now, in terms of the drivers to decarbonization, we've talked about the nationally determined contribution set by the Government of India, net zero by 2070, GHG intensity to be reduced to 45% from 2005 levels by 2030. The recent submissions by the Government of India talk about this 45%, as in we have already achieved 33% when it comes to our GHG intensity compared to the 2005 levels. So achieving that 45% reduction is a possibility, as a distinct possibility. In terms of 50% cumulative power from non-fossil fuel resources, which we intended to do by 2030, we've already done 42% as we speak today. So that's also a substantial achievement. But yeah, there again, as we were speaking, there's a long way to go. Net zero by 2070. That's another term that we will discuss about in our later slides. Various initiatives that have already been initiated. There was a National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was instituted around 2008 to 2010, under which we had the National Mission on Enhanced Energy Efficiency, through which there was a Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme which was implemented, which allowed for energy efficiency measures to be instituted at a large scale among industries in the country. Incidentally, the National Solar Mission was also instituted under this NAPCC, and that happened in 2010. And a large portion of the renewable integration that we see today is also an outcome of the policy measures which were brought into place around 13-14 years back. Other than that, due to the Clean Development Mechanism which had been instituted by the UNFCCC body, there are a lot of carbon emission reduction certificates which have been transacted, a lot of projects which have been instituted in our country, which have also led to substantial decarbonization. SEBI BRSR guidelines we've already talked about, implemented to about 1,000 companies. Incidentally, I was looking through quite a few of these BRSR reports as of yesterday, and the interesting part about that is most of them touch about only renewable energy related activities that they would have done, right? So that's a huge gap again that needs to be filled. While a lot of work has happened on the energy efficiency side, but in terms of bringing a sort of structure, framework and and ability to standardize the GHG reduction projects and activities, there's a long way again we have to go. And in that sense, CBAM, which is a measure which is being implemented by Europe, is something that is already impacting industries here. Also because all said and done, whether we have a regulatory framework or not, the fact remains that a lot of large companies, and by virtue of that, a lot of medium tier companies also, who are sort of tier 1 suppliers to these large companies, are a part of the global supply chain. The moment you are a part of the global supply chain, a lot of activities which are being done to decarbonize at the global level are also impacting the companies here, and that provides an economic signal. So irrespective of the legal signals or the regulatory signals, an economic signal actually works, and a lot of companies are therefore voluntarily taking up measures to figure out ways to decarbonize. The carbon credit market is being developed in India. It's expected that in this calendar year, we should have the carbon credit trading scheme implemented, which would be on the similar lines as the PAT mechanism in terms of it being a baseline and credit mechanism. The green trade market related policy has already been brought out. However, it really needs to be structured well so that the voluntary mechanisms related to the green trade market develops well. All said and done, when you look at carbon neutrality and net zero transition efforts, as I mentioned, mixture of all these regulations, policies, economic signals are trickling down, not just to the large companies which are already trying to do activities there, but also to MSMEs, at least SMEs who are tier 1 suppliers to these large corporates, and therefore is being taken seriously. If you look at some of the numbers here, so if you look at the perform, achieve and trade, almost 110 million tons of carbon dioxide emission reduction has already happened due to measures here, which has impacted almost 13 sectors, industry sectors, more than 1300 designated consumers. And if you look at the overall set of activities done for energy efficiency, including things like the LED bulb implementation like Ujala and all, the total number goes up to about 306 million tons of carbon dioxide emission reduction. In terms of REC, the Renewable Energy Certificate Mechanism, which was brought in around 2010 under the National Solar Mission, along with pathways towards integration of renewable energy, that has also led to substantial emission reduction, almost to the range of 73 million tons. The Clean Development Mechanism, through which CER related projects were set up in India, although they were sort of used for the purpose of offsetting emissions in various developed countries, but they led to about 310 million ton carbon dioxide emission reduction. Now, renewables. We've heard a lot about how integration of renewable energy has happened in the country, and this graph traces from independence till now. And if you look at the last few years, the amount of renewable, so this is renewable energy in terms of solar, wind, biomass, etc. And this blue portion is hydro. So when we say 42%, it is non-fossil fuel based generation, which means renewable as well as hydro. So that is the installed capacity. However, if you look at the percentage of electricity generated from these sources and being utilized, so that is on the right hand side, you will find about 20%, give or take a few percentage points here and there, is what is the contribution from these sources. It's a very simple computation. A renewable energy plant has about 20% of plant load factor versus a thermal energy plant which has almost 85% plant load factor. So for the same capacity, a thermal plant will generate 4 times more than what a renewable capacity will do. Also because, and this hides quite a few things which are very specific to the power sector, right? These broad numbers, these aggregate numbers don't tell the full story. Why doesn't it tell the full story? So let me give you a quick example. These 170 megawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity, out of which about 130 megawatts is renewable capacity, impact the power sector in its full glory during a hot summer day, right? So say 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all of these will be running full, which would also mean that you have to ramp down the remaining thermal power generation. But come evening at 6 o'clock and suddenly all of this vanishes and you have to suddenly ramp up your thermal generation, right? So our country, and incidentally our country is, I'm not sure whether many people would be aware of this or not, is also is the largest interconnected power grid in the world. All right. In terms of installed capacity, we are the third largest. In terms of power generation, we are the third largest. So it's a very large synchronous grid that we are operating in our country. And that also means that at any time a large portion of the generation capacity comes out of the grid, you have to manage it using other sources, right? You don't really have affordable or large scale commercially viable storage available in the country, which would allow you to use all of this green power, store it there, and not even require the use of thermal power in any other way. All this story about gas, natural gas, that's a narrative which works very well for other nations. It doesn't really work well for us, for the simple reason gas is not really available for our country for power generation, right? And even for those countries which have been trying to club it happily along with their renewable generation, it doesn't really work, because ultimately gas is also leading to carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So for us, coal-based power plant, coal is a resource that we have in our country. It provides substantial economic benefits to a large portion of our country, right, is a reality. And therefore, when we talk about net zero by 2070, even under those circumstances, we will have coal-based generation, which would be required, because all said and done, I mean, it reminds me of, and we did talk about food as a major thing in the first session. It reminds me of Sri Lanka's economic crisis, 2019, not too far back, right? While there were many reasons for that, and you can't really put your finger onto saying that there is only one reason for such an economic crisis to impact a nation, whether it was COVID and reduction in tourism numbers. Tourism plays about 10% of the GDP in Sri Lanka. There were substantial tax cuts, there were impacts related to the debt burden, but also very interestingly, Sri Lanka at that point of time tried to move their entire agriculture to organic farming, right, leaving aside fertilizers, and saying that we want to be the first country in the world which will shift its entire agriculture to organic farming. The results were not really good, unfortunately. 25% to 40% reduction in production of rice, in production of tea, huge impact in terms of food supplies, right? So the little point that I'm trying to make here is good intentions don't really result in good outcomes unless and until the pathway of that good intention to the good outcome is planned well. So while at one point of time we would love to have a lot of renewable energy, right, it is cost effective, it makes sense for industries, and I'll give you some more inputs in terms of how industries are adopting to that, because if you remember, I just told you that in BRSR reporting you will hear loads of industries trying to move towards renewable. But getting that integrated into our grid, getting that implemented such that it does not completely distort the market, does not completely adversely affect people and our living using all the electricity that we're using all the time, is something that has to be planned properly. All right. Now, if you look at the major contributors to carbon emission, and I would not go down the path of agriculture and all the part other than the industry, so to speak. So you have power, 35% odd. You have certain industrial sectors which contribute substantially: iron, steel, cement, transportation. You have others as well in terms of refineries, petrochemicals, and so on, but to a slightly lesser extent. Now, India's total emissions is about 3 gigatons, right? 3 billion tons. If you look at these particular industries, and we have to see it again in terms of where India is trying to progress. We have a population of almost 1.5 billion people in our country, 140 crores, right? We want to grow rapidly, we want to bring people out of poverty, we want to make sure that the standards of living are improved substantially, and the fact is the energy consumption per capita in our country is one of the lowest. At least electricity consumption is about 1000 kilowatt hours, slightly more than that. And when you compare it with any large country also, it is substantially lower, right? We expect by 2050 that almost 3 to 4 times of demand increase is going to happen in the steel and cement sector. Cement, incidentally, is again the second most used human-made commodity after potable water. So after water, that is the thing that we use the most. So cement is a reality of life. If we suddenly say that let's move everything to sustainable, materials, it's simply not going to happen, right? Iron and steel, all the infrastructure that we have been seeking in terms of whether it is roadways, whether it is connection through railways, whether it is buildings, whatever else, iron and steel is again a necessity. I mean, we might not see it, we might not like it, but it is there and it's there to stay. In essence, growth of India means growth of these industries, growth of these sectors, and therefore the related emissions that come along with that. The question therefore is, how do we make sure that the carbon emissions or the emission intensity of this development can be reduced, and reduced in a way that it is sustainable and does not disrupt adversely the growth pattern that we want to seek for our country. Now, we've been hearing about net zero carbon neutrality, so a very quick introduction to those terms. I'm quite sure most of the audience would be completely aware of it. 2 minutes. I have no clue whether I would be able to finish within that or not. So forgive me if I can't. All right. Carbon neutrality is, three ways of emission that can be reported. Scope 1 is where the industry or the entity is emitting the carbon for its own purposes, owned and controlled by the company. Scope 2 is primarily power procurement in our case, heat and steam procurement if in case our company does that. And scope 3 is from vendors and customers. So reducing it down to zero for scope 1 and 2 is what gives a company carbon neutrality. If you reduce scope 3 down to zero is what we call net zero, right? Most technologies have been varying around energy efficiency, electrification of industrial processes, renewable power, sustainable mobility, and of course now green hydrogen, which has substantial use cases across industries and domains, and then of course carbon removal. All right. Some of the activities which are being undertaken are obviously renewable energy that we talked about, electrification of heat and avoidance of fossil fuels. So wherever arc furnaces could be used, or wherever boilers can be replaced, are places that industries have been trying to figure out ways of electrifying. Energy efficiency improvements have been happening, as we already pointed out, under the PAT scheme, but of course that needs to be taken substantially forward. Waste heat recovery again is a place where industries have been spending money to make sure that is done, and in minor proportion biomass as feedstock or fuel. It's not really taken up in a very large scale, also because of various issues related to getting these or sourcing these in a commercially viable manner. And at a smaller scale, if you look at, and I'm giving the examples of steel and cement only because they have such a huge impact in terms of the emissions that come from the industry. Activities like installation of top recovery turbines and pulverized coal injection in blast furnaces, use of plastics to replace pulverized coal, direct rolling, hot charging of direct reduced iron in electric arc furnaces. Cement, and this is very important, right? Cement carbon emissions is not only because of the use of fossil fuels, right? The first part that happens in cement is you have to calcine CaCO3, calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, CaO. This basic chemical process releases CO2 into the atmosphere. So whether you use fossil fuel or don't use fossil fuel, you can't avoid this simple chemical process. The cement industry claims that all the CO2 that has been released during this calcination process sort of gets absorbed by concrete over a period of time, which is called mineral recarbonation. A lot of studies that have been going on over here, but Like in all studies, it all depends upon who sponsored it. But having said that, yes, mineral recarbonation does take place, but can we only rely upon that to make sure that carbon emissions of a large industry like cement can be reduced? In my opinion, no, but we need to find alternatives for that. Now, I'll come to the challenges part of it once. Now, key emerging technology, of course, green hydrogen. So green hydrogen has a substantive use case, right? It can be a storage of fuel. It can be used in steel manufacturing for green steel. And when I say steel manufacturing, not only as a fuel, because it can be used as a direct reducing agent again. It can be used again, for transportation fuel as well. Carbon capture, utilization and storage, absolutely nascent right now, something that would take decades probably to come to a commercially viable scale. But this is something that we would really need to put our attention into if we want to figure out ways to abate in places like cement and all. Okay, very quickly. Challenges: large scale RE integration requires policy and regulatory barriers for RE adoption to be addressed, and there are lots of barriers there. As we are speaking about, the impact on electricity grids is something that causes commercial implication on the state utilities the way they are structured right now. The economic incentives are not structured well enough for RE integration to be allowed by these states. The second part is, of course, the technical part. Even if you were to take all RE, how do you really use it if you are a process industry and you need round the clock power supply? So some of these issues are being addressed as we speak. Integration of battery energy storage, pumped hydro storage, various other forms of figuring out whether wind solar hybrids can work in tandem. Lot of support going on there, but this is something that will only evolve as we go along. Managing hard to abate industrial processes is something that we'll need to, there's a lot of research that needs to go into this. Primary research in terms of figuring out alternative materials, figuring out alternatives to chemical processes, even simple things like, the difficulty of achieving high temperature in electric furnaces. It simply causes issues in industry when you're looking at a highly competitive commodity sector, where again the economic signals are absent in terms of bringing in the cost of such kind of technology. Carbon pricing, CCTS hopefully should be able to bring in some amount of carbon pricing which will give economic signals to industries. And of course, creation of demand signals by the government and the ability of industries to bring in the finance and the capacity, and ultimately the need for financing at an unprecedented scale. The numbers we're talking about goes into trillions of dollars. The ability of our country to generate that kind of finances is simply not there unless and until we are able to lead in terms of technology development and adoption, which will allow the Indian companies to also grow. And I was saying disorderly transition. That is what we need to be very, very careful about. Creation of stranded assets, especially in a I'll give a very quick example again. 2016 or so, 16-17, when we had the coal sector related issues, right? This was an economic policy constraint which forced the Supreme Court to stop various coal mines from supplying to thermal power projects, and the moment that happened, there was a huge amount of stranded capacity which were created in this generation space. As a country, we really cannot afford to have large assets where public money has been invested to simply become stranded. So that is a part that we need to be very careful about. So path ahead, of course, renewable energy, electrification of mobility and green hydrogen, as I mentioned, has several use cases. And if we go forward in terms of material circularity, carbon capture and carbon markets and pricing, I'm sure a substantial amount of abatement can take place in our country as well. So with that, thank you.